Okay, I'm going to start the webinar. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are admitting the numerous attendees to this evening's webinar. So thank you so much to all of you. As we give our Zoom platform an opportunity to actually admit everybody, I'm going to thank you all for your patience. We're going to be able to start in a couple of seconds. Thank you so much. We have a very large number of attendees, which is always wonderful to see. Thank you so much. And okay, it looks like we're going to be ready to start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Leila Logezeko. I'm the president of the City Club of New York, and I thank you for joining us tonight as we navigate the next chapter of our webinar series on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. So 2 weeks ago, you may remember that we set sail with an in-depth discussion of the terminal's role in our city's economy, and tonight we chart a course towards the critical challenges that will shape its future. The Brooklyn Marine Terminal spans 122 acres of city-owned waterfront in Brooklyn, as the name says it. It is one of the last remaining working harbors in Brooklyn. The city is plotting a new course for the site, exploring a mix of uses from housing to modern port infrastructure, all the while grappling with the rising tides of maritime demand. And yet, there's a storm on the horizon. The entire site lies in a coastal flood zone. And so far, the city's planning efforts have failed to address the climate vulnerabilities threatening Red Hook and the Columbia Street waterfront. So tonight, we're going to drop anchor with a panel of experts who will help us steer through these complex waters. They will discuss how to balance development, resilience, and the future of our working waterfront, ensuring that whatever is built here can weather the storm ahead. And to help us understand the critical challenges facing the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, we are joined by experts whose work spans from architecture, climate science, urban design, and international planning. And their insight will help us think about a smarter, more resilient development along our waterfront. So tonight we're joined by Geeta Nandan. She is an architect, designer, and leader in community resilience planning and design. As the co-chair of the Resilient Red Hook Committee, she has been deeply involved in shaping strategies to safeguard the neighborhood from climate threats while ensuring thoughtful, community-driven development. Klaus Jacob is a geophysicist, rebuilder, and globally recognized expert in earthquakes, disasters, and climate resiliency. With over 50 years at Columbia University Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, his research has shaped disaster response and preparedness policies worldwide. Walter Meyer is an urban designer and adjunct professor at Stanford University with vast experience in the formulation of resiliency plans. His extensive experience in resiliency planning has influenced urban policies and infrastructure projects designed to withstand the growing impact of climate change. And tonight's discussion will be guided by our moderator, Carter Kraft. He is a senior economic officer at the Consulate General of the Netherlands here in New York City, and a seasoned planner with decades of experience in water, transportation, and land use. His expertise in integrating economic development with sustainable urban planning will help steer tonight's conversation. So we look forward to an engaging discussion. And Carter, the floor is yours, or maybe should I say the helm is yours.
At the wheel, my friend. Thank you, Layla. And I think it's safe to say we're not here to talk about if we can pull off a climate resilient Brooklyn Marine Terminal, but how we can pull off a climate resilient Brooklyn Marine Terminal. We've got a great panel tonight. Thank you, Layla, for the introduction. You mentioned that precious and contested 122 acres along Buttermilk Channel in New York Harbor. I think if we add the blue space, all that wet space between Piers 7 through 12, we're well up to over 200 acres of space within the project area within this scope. If I can just project a little bit, I'd like to say that I think most parties want to achieve a master plan that will be physically sustainable, economically sustainable, as well as politically sustainable. We can't forget that there's been a million meetings over the past 40 years about the future of the Brooklyn Piers, including this 7 through 12 area, which I think honestly has been the topic of public discussions and private negotiations, even probably going back to 2002 in the first Bloomberg administration. The biggest question I see isn't just what, but how this district can help make this idea, the city's idea of this harbor of the future, happen in sync and happen in synergy with all these other still young and emerging hubs along the waterfront of Brooklyn. The hubs I'm talking about, well, I should not just Brooklyn, but we'll see. The hubs I'm referring to include Brooklyn Navy Yard, Governor's Island, here at 7 through 12, the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, Made Bush Terminal, and the Brooklyn Army Terminal. It's a great, string of pearls if we can make the most of it. My question to the panel really is twofold. One, can this master planning effort really help tie all these initiatives together in a way that the whole of it is even greater than the sum of its parts? And two, given all that these places are on the water, on the harbor, what is the most that we can do to infuse all these plans and designs with as much water as possible? And when I say water, I mean water aware, water sensitive, water based, water enhancing, water centric design, and water based programming. To paraphrase the late architect Stan Eckstedt, who passed away not too long ago, he was really inspiring to me 30 years ago when I had the privilege to meet him in his office. He worked on the first iterations of Battery Park City and some other great mega projects around. He said, start with the plan for the water. And I think the Blue Highway, supporting and scaling the green economy, and we can work our way upland to figure out how the land can best be used. So over the next 75 minutes, we get to learn and discuss with some great planning and design experts what they have to say about the site, as well as about ways to responsibly confront some of these challenges. Some of what we learn can help us map out some steps forward to enable this ambitious visioning and planning effort to move forward. Let's face it, these opportunities of attention and investment, they only come along every 5-10 years, sometimes less, depending on who is in office and what borough they hail from. But before I get started, I want to pause and just take a quick look around some of the other districts around New York Harbor. Through 4 mayors over the past 27 years, we've seen the creation of some really interesting and vibrant waterfront districts. All of these offer some lessons for the rethinking and redevelopment of areas such as the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. For example, Battery Park City taught us the importance of starting with the plan for the public space and not just the plan for the developable lots. Hudson River Park taught us the importance of meaningful and continuous interim programming, and using that access to build support for building out the long-term vision. Queens West and that part of Long Island City has shown that a mix of uses, commercial, residential, and preserving industrial, let me emphasize that again, and preserving industrial has many benefits, and that just adding in space for community supporting retail doesn't mean that retail is ever going to show up. And I think another lesson from Queens West is that the water-based programming doesn't just happen. It really needs to be built in to the plan and thought about and conceptualized and designed and catalyzed in the beginning. Brooklyn Bridge Park, South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, Industry City, Brooklyn Army Terminal, they all show us in a maritime sense how important it is to keep the land together, to keep the land in the district contiguous, because once you carve it up, you'll lose the great opportunities that exist with having these larger footprints, these larger contiguous areas. When real estate speculation benefits the few, a sustainable master plan brings the potential to create the most good for the most people. So thank you for the opportunity to introduce the discussion tonight. We will be taking questions and answers through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And it's now my privilege to turn it over to Klaus for a presentation. And Klaus will be followed, I think, by Gita and then by Walter. Thank you. Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And can I please have slides?
Mission control, mission control. Klaus hailing.
Go to the next two. 1, 2. And then to slide number 3. Next, please. Okay. No, go back 1. Bad. Thank you very much.
Maybe go into presentation mode.
Yes, please go to presentation. One. Can we have presentation mode? Well, maybe I start talking without slides. After all, the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, by its very definition, will have to be on the waterfront to be accessible to ships and goods being shipped. Still not presentation mode. In that slide that you saw for a few seconds, there were red areas and there were white areas. The red areas are currently used for marine purposes, while the white areas are either unused or for other commercial purposes. And when we get the slide backs, go to the next slide. Next one. Since it is on the waterfront, we have to cope with sea level rise and coastal storm surges on the waterfront itself, and of course with other hazards such as severe precipitation inland from that project in Red Hook. Here you see a scale from about the year 2000 to 2100 in 4 different colors. The elevations that start here at the year 2000 with a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm, a 500-year storm, and 700-year storm. I won't go into the definition, but a 100-year storm has a 1% chance to occur in any given year. Now, at the year 2000, or where that dotted line is, that was when Sandy occurred. And we are now at the year 2025, where those next set of squares is plotted on those lines. As you see, these storm surges get lifted up with time because of sea level rise. That means if you had in the year 2012, 11.5 feet of storm surge during Sandy, which is a 700-year storm, it takes in the year 2090 only a 10-year storm to reach the same elevation. Divide 700 by 10, that's a 70-fold increase in the coastal flood hazard. That's what we have to consider, combination of sea level rise and storm surge. Now, let's look what the current flood zones show. This is the New York City flood mapper. You can go to the city website under the name New York City Flood Mapper, and you will find this map. The darker blue is on this map the 1% per year flood zone, and the lighter one is the 500-year or 0% per year annual chance of flooding. And we have the area opposing Governor's Island being the area that's being considered for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. It sits in a flood zone. But that flood zone wraps around into Red Hook and then back into the Gowanus Canal area a little bit farther to the east. Next slide is a blow-up of that same area, and just to now demonstrate where that Brooklyn Marine Terminal is, go to the next slide. And here you have it superimposed. It goes from the northern end of Governor's Island to a little bit beyond the southern end of Governor's Island opposing. And this sits squarely in the flood zone. So, given that, what are the design options for this project? How do we either protect those future investments that are being planned for the retrofit? Or how do we design it if we don't protect them by flood walls, but simply by sheer elevation? Well, let's look what some proposals that have been made look like. The US Army Corps of Engineers, next slide, shows for its option 3B, the alternative 3B, which is the only one that's right now on the screen and under discussion. The other options so far have been discarded. What you see here in blue, if you go to the labeling in the upper left, is the blue are areas where shoreline protection measures are being undertaken. Not necessarily by the US Army Corps of Engineers, but for instance, wrapping around Manhattan is the so-called Big U. And then we see here in Brooklyn, there's a red zone on the waterfront and then a blue signature here behind it. And the green areas are the ones that are supposedly protected by those blue devices. The red areas are unprotected and exposed to storm surges. Next slide, please, is simply a blow up of the same thing, where I show with this little square next to, or rectangle next to the Governor Island, where the Brooklyn Marine Terminal sits. And as you can see, the Brooklyn Marine Terminal proper sits in the flood zone and is not protected by this blue signature, which is not clear what the US Army Corps of Engineers plan had in mind, whether they would provide with their own financing protection or with a city. And that's where I went to, next slide please, to the city website where the Department of Design and Construction published in November 20 of of 2024, so just about 4 months ago, a document that specified the plans that the New York City DDC, the Department of Design and Construction, but with knowledge of the EDC, which is here on that cover, has produced. And when we look at that, next slide, that's what we get. They have a flood protection system, which is at elevation 10 feet above the North American Vertical Datum of 1988, which is the reference for all flood zone maps and other projects. And if you go forward one slide, you see that only in the upper part of that project, it has a flat wall. Then it is simply using the natural grade of the streets and then goes again back into the southern part of this project to a flat wall. But it does not connect over to the Gowanus Canal that I have shown you earlier. Is an opening for floodwater coming the back door into Red Hook. Given that, and go to next slide, the area then that is protected sits behind essentially the white area and supposedly a little bit behind it to the northeast, which is where the elevated portion of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway runs, this dark feature here, connecting the upper white line with the lower white line. And beyond that, the elevation is high enough that we wouldn't have to worry. But go now to the next and last slide that I have in my presentation. Look where 10 feet is on this earlier plot that I showed you. At current sea level, this orange line that goes down in the year 2025 covers a little bit more than the 100-year flood zone. But on the waterfront, you have also wave action, so 10 feet is just barely making it. But that's at current sea level. Now the sea level goes up, and you see where this horizontal orange line at 10 feet crosses in the year 2070, the 10-year storm surge, which means that flood protection that the DDC is having in mind will be overtopped already just by a 10-year storm, not to speak by the 100-year storm, which will be overtopped in the 2030s here. So I think I do not see at this moment what this project has in mind to protect its own properties on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal property proper, or anything behind in the neighborhoods of the Columbia Street waterfront district or in other portions of Red Hook. So I'm really puzzled how a plan that supposedly is finished by the end of April, if I'm correctly informed, can proceed without having a clear plan how to deal with these flood conditions. I think this is, in my mind, untenable. The City Club itself had a couple of months ago proposed that there should be a temporary help me.
Partial.
What was it?
A partial moratorium.
a partial moratorium for new buildings placed in flood zones. Now, this project, if it really wants to put 7,000 to 12,000 new apartment units on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal proper, would totally be against such a suggestion for a moratorium. But this is an opinion that needs to be discussed with the public and, of course, with the city agency and with the Economic Development Corporation on any users that are intended to be housed in this neighborhood in the future. My suggestion is that no elevation below 14 feet, NAFTA 88, should be contemplated for any use whatsoever on the property, because otherwise, within a few decades, it's totally wasted investment. Thank you, and I hand over to, I guess, Gita is the next speaker.
Thank you, Klaus. Hard act to follow. Klaus has an incredible amount of detailed information, but I have to say it's actually really, really critical and very important to be looking at those hard numbers in terms of our floodplains and our sea level rise in order to truly understand what the potential is both of the site and of the neighborhood in general. And with that, can we have my first slide, please? I am going to try and keep my portion succinct once I get my image up. And so playing a little bit off of Klaus's presentation on the data, which is just very, very important as a starting point. Data is where we should always have our foundation for planning our futures. This image is what the reality of Red Hook was during Superstorm Sandy, in that 12-foot sea level rise moment. And the Superstorm Sandy really provided a lens, a picture, a vision of what Red Hook has for, our future conditions, with flooded streets, power outages that lasted for months, historical housing units that were greatly impacted, our neighborhood and all low-lying conditions across the city sort of had a similar life and a real awakening, right, of what we're going to be experiencing within the next 100 years, as Klaus has pointed out. And so the question really is, how does this BMT project that lies on our shorelines at over 120 acres, right? We just heard close to 200 acres when we look at the water being included in it. And it also stretches for about 3 miles along our coastline. Red Hook is about 8 miles in circumference, and the BMT is about 3 miles. So a third of our coast, which, when we're looking at coastal edge protection, is a real significant player. So the big question is, what will our community look like in 100 years? What do we want our community to look like in 100 years? How do we want our community to be protected in 100 years? And what's the role of the BMT within that vision? Planning for a huge parcel in a very short period of time is not likely going to give us the paradigm shift that we need and the radical revisioning that we need in order to achieve this future vision. So, thinking about how Red Hook as a community, Columbia Heights as a community, this entire region really needs what we call community resilience. And this parcel has an ability to contribute to a larger, broader community-based resilience plan, and not just think about the site as a single entity. And in order to do that, we have to look broader, we have to be more inclusionary, and we have to be a little bit more radical in the way that we approach this. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So there are examples that exist across the world, and this is one of them. I'm going to speak very briefly to this project, which is, this is an image of Hafen City in Hamburg, Germany, and it was created over several decades. The project actually started in 2005 with a master plan being done in 7 years. So 2013 is when they started implementing their master plan. Hafen City has a really broad mix of uses, including maritime and port uses, residential, commercial, and it was developed by a group called the IBA, IBA Hamburg and IBA Hafen City. It is sort of a governmental structure that incorporates local residents, commercial entities, a really broad range of stakeholders into the process, not just as voices, but actually into the entire process of the development. And as you can see here, so just a little general information, Hamburg lies on the Elbe River, which has pretty drastic flooding that happens during spring tides, due to ice melts upland. And so this area can see flooding from anywhere from 7 to 12 feet. And so in reaction to that, and there have been in 60s and 80s and beyond, there have been very serious flooding that has happened in this inner city harbor. And so in reaction to that, and then wanting to rebuild their port area, they were able to build what is considered to be one of the most sort of big, a really good example of climate resilient urban design within their inner harbor. So here you can see both maritime port that was built, and then all of the buildings being raised, up above that floodplain, parking being located below, and then there is pedestrian access that happens sort of at that second story at the upper level. So there's sort of like a deck that this is built upon. But then it sort of has get downs into the waterways, it has maritime access. And if you can go to the next slide. The flooding that happens, so all of these first floors are able to be shut down. There's also a workforce that works in tandem with this, and that workforce, when there is an emergency call, they come through and they shut down all of the very large floodgates that are associated with each of the buildings and that are associated with the various different streetways. By having the parking underground, they're actually able to relieve most of the streets from parking. So this is sort of where I would really like for the BMT project to think about how do we more radically innovate in terms of our urban design. So it's not just the typical standard, maybe street grid with, street side parking and buildings. And, is there a way to actually really think about pedestrian thoroughfares and a more community integrated design thinking, so that way the community can have greater access to the water and be able to also be a part of the fabric of the BMT. If you can go to the next slide. And one of the really important parts of the way that this was designed and built was that each parcel was also developed by a different developer. So it wasn't a single hand across the entire, so IBA Hafen City also became IBA Hamburg, and there was a broader development that happened. And so being able to bring in multiple actors, multiple voices, allowed the fabric to develop a little bit more naturally. So that way the master plan allotted for different players to come in. The other important aspect of this project was that it was not funded only by housing. infrastructure and community-based resilience needs to also be funded by the public, right? And it needs to actually happen first, and development then needs to come once the resilience has been put into place. And when I talk about resilience, I'm not just talking about sea level rise and waterfront resilience, but we're also talking about energy, social, right? Providing educational, ensuring that our social fabric is kept intact. That was actually one of the most beautiful parts about Superstorm Sandy, if there was one, was that the social network that became very clear in the response to the disaster and the emergency response was really there. You know, residents were able to really come together to support each other. So how does this community resilience support that in the future through the building of the BMT? I sort of pose that as a question without necessarily knowing what the answer is, but I think it's an important question that we need to ask ourselves. And if you can go to the next slide. And one of the first projects that was actually built was a floating structure. And this floating structure houses an educational facility. It's where their offices and headquarters are, and it's one of the areas where education around the project started. So education, or sort of outreach, was throughout the entire project. And sort of going to Carter's point about, you know, there's also water as a part of the BMT. So how do we incorporate beyond just that hardened edge, right? And really go out into the water and have the water be a part of the conversation. Go to the next slide. And so, you know, it's actually almost easier to start with a floating structure, which you could sort of deploy in the very near future as a part of the BMT project, and really thinking about activating that shoreline and how we bring attention to that shoreline. And you know, Walter will probably talk about the sort of nature-based solutions and how we can soften our shoreline. But as we're taking this master planning process, and I advocate for slowing the process down. We don't need to try and get this done within the next few months. It actually takes quite a bit of time for visioning to happen, for us to really understand what we want over the next 100 years, and how the BMT project is going to allow for that. And so with that, I will turn it over to Walter.
Hi, everyone. Walter Rodriguez-Meyer here. Next slide. I want to talk about another tool in the toolkit, which is using evapotranspiration to lower groundwater. 1,000 years ago, when Lenape were managing this land, there was a known check and balance between the groundwater and the forest. When the groundwater was elevated, the forest would lower that groundwater because it was connected to that groundwater. Fast forward, Dr. Leonard Stinto from Florida International University built these artificial tree islands adjacent to the Everglades, and put groundwater sensors in this new tree island that mimicked the ancient tree islands of the Everglades. And he measured a 1/4 inch drop per day in those tree islands. And that makes a big difference over time. It adds up. And that was a 2015 study. So Dr. Leonard Stinto. Next slide. And in 2016, my firm was commissioned to design Miracle Mile and Giralda Plaza in Miami. That's in Coral Gables. It was a soggy district that would flood with summer rains. Next slide. And we took that Miracle Mile concept and embedded in it Dr. Leonard Stinto's science, his work, which was can an entire district become a tree island and help lower the groundwater? And it was published in the New York Times because it worked so well that it was tested by Hurricane Irma, and a lot of the businesses were able to open the next day after one of the heaviest rains in many years in Miami's history. It took Miami many months to recover from that event, but in Miracle Mile, it was untouched. Next slide. And how do you take a tree island concept and bring it through an entire district. It's to look at the subsoil, to look at the subsurface condition. That is to excavate, the impervious urban fill that's in a city and get down to the porous subgeology and connect the groundwater to the trees by creating a porous soil condition through structural soil or other means of getting connectivity from the surface to the ground. Next slide. And so in this project, it was excavating the entire right-of-way from facade to facade, backfilling with structural soil. And for lack of a better term, we call it a living street because there are tree roots under the travel lanes. Miracle Mile had travel lanes that were a state highway coming through the city blocks. Giralda Plaza was a local street that was converted to a promenade that occasionally has traffic and was rated for fire truck sanitation, which come through daily. Shop owners can put their the alfresco dining out of their shops and gain square footage. And at night they fold that up. The shop owners manage the street. This is just to show that you can design streets in low-lying areas by managing groundwater to buy time. Next slide. And some of these specs are starting to be built in New York. We had projects built before Hurricane Ida that were pilots in the Rockaways. Rockaways is comparative to Red Hook, similar elevations, in some places lower. It's kind of the canary in a coal mine for New York City. In this project, it's the same acreage. It's called Arverne East. It's the same acreage as the project we're discussing today. It's just slightly over 120 acres, several $1 billion in real estate coming, and that's now under construction. Next slide. This project started with groundwater, and we're recommending that as BMT moves forward, to connect itself to the groundwater, to connect itself to the bathymetry in front of it in the salt water, and think about the intertidal relationship between groundwater and tidal water. Why? Because from there we can build out not only some of the cultural dependencies in water that Carter Craft laid out, but we can start to build resilient infrastructure that is holistically managing water from clouds in the sky to the water in the ground underneath. In the case with Rockaway, it was a story of Arverne East taking a cut and fill balance project that understood that the ocean side is high elevation, the bay side is a medium elevation, and the bowl in the middle is where the groundwater is most exposed. So the most frequent flooding happens near the middle of the peninsula, not at the edges. And you may see in Red Hook during king tides, you may be blocks from the bay or from the harbor and see water bubbling up in the drains. And that is normal in Rockaway as well. Being a property owner, a homeowner in Rockaway and having my office in Gowanus, I compare the two of them and I take my motorboat from my bay house in Rockaway to Gowanus Canal. It takes about a half hour to commute. And that allows me to see the correlation. Sometimes on a king tide, I can see drains that no longer flow. And in places like Rockaway, when those drains backfill during the king tide, your only line of defense is green infrastructure. And so this project took that thin white line that you see in the center is the kind of freshwater bubble that's exposed during king tides. That's fresh water floating on top of salt. And so the entire project was designed as a massive dewatering project using soil-based subsurface gravel wetlands and connected rain gardens. Next slide. And thinking holistically across jurisdictions and funding. So not just think of BMT, but think of the neighbors around you and the businesses around you. Red Hook is unique in that there's very few lots that are discontiguous, and organizations like the O'Connell organization has really been thinking about on the business side of things. It's one of the largest landowners outside of the city in Red Hook. And I think integrating business into this, also integrating the community, and activating the water as much as possible. One of the most interesting things of New York City from me as a maritime person is South Street Seaport or the Mary Welland, which is in Red Hook, to visit those boats and to have more boats activated, both for private, public, institutional, and all layers of culture in the water, not just at the water. Next slide. Arvernese, as a cross section, is meant to start with that groundwater. And here you see the bubble of salt water, a bubble of fresh water floating on top of salt, and how that's co-managed throughout the project. We elevated to +16 for the streets and the first floor elevations to all match. So urban design is resilient, not just elevating the buildings only. The adjacent neighborhood had low-lying streets, so we improved their condition by creating a belt of low-lying green infrastructure that's the lowest point in the neighborhood that helps to de-water the existing streets, not just our own. Next slide. And this is photography fresh from the site. Pardon the roughness of the construction, but it indicates how we get from the high ground of 16, which is on the right of the slide, sloping down with ADA compliant universal slopes to the existing roads, which are +5 and 6, and then having even lower network green infrastructure that is a mile long of network systems that de-water the groundwater. So the issue in New York City right now is our guidelines only allow for green infrastructure that's above the groundwater, several feet above, which eliminates zone 1. That eliminates Red Hook from technically having green infrastructure. What we've introduced by partnering with Nick Patnotny from DOT and DEP, Alan Cohn, is creating pilots of built subsurface groundwater management green infrastructure that has a new set of rules that are transferred from other jurisdictions. And these projects, some of them were built before IDA. The image on the left is Beach Green. It had a groundwater management landscape as well as a bioswale for managing surface water and roof runoff. This entire slide on the left is all one big living system below the surface program. So below the parking lot, below the porous playground, below the porous paving, all that stuff is all interconnected with one big root system through one massive structural soil that goes several feet deep. And this was tested by Hurricane Ida. And this site, despite being a low-lying neighborhood that flooded, this site stayed completely dry. Next slide. Next slide. And as I mentioned, this is a cloudburst street. It's built. We can go do field trips in the spring. It's over a mile long of network green infrastructure. Stormwater is managed in the street, at the edge of the street. We partner with Parks Department to manage water in the Parks Department and set up co-management plans for stormwater across the agencies. Next slide. We keep over 1 million gallons of stormwater that could have legally discharged into Jamaica Bay is now used to irrigate this linear system. And it's important to manage water. We have systems for private property as well as public. Next slide. And working with PDC on existing systems that Parks Department, DEP, and DOT have to move water from the street into the side on the Parks Department side. So, and kind of embracing that frame aesthetically and architecturally. Next slide. And it's very complex to pull this off in New York, to bring together Army Corps, DEC, MTA, DOT, all the different agencies that we needed to move water across jurisdictions the way that nature intended to flow. So it's not easy, but we pulled it off. It took a decade to do this project. Next slide. And I'll leave it there, but the big takeaway is we had a lot of successes with Arvernese, but a lot of imperfections. One of which we wanted to change the legal grade of the Queens datum, which is currently +8. By definition, legal grade is an invisible line that exists above existing streets. So if you have a street that's +4 in Red Hook, somewhere there's a legal grade of when that street gets upgraded, it should be moved to. But the legal grade at +8 is not that high. We need to be in a resilient legal grade. So one of the recommendations I would make to BMT is to work community-wide, as Geeta pointed out, work with the businesses in the district, work with the neighborhoods around in your watershed, and get that legal grade elevated as much as you can, and use this project to spur a layered approach to this. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you all. I see some things coming into the Q&A box. So thanks, Klaus and Geeta and Walter. Maybe you can see that too. I think Layla's backstage somewhere too. Thanks for the introduction and the slides. We've got about 30 more minutes for Q&A, so I'm going to jump right into the box. A couple people have mentioned about the issue related to the project area per se. And maybe it should be sort of thought of in the context of the BQE and even the future of the BQE, as well as, you know, the existing presence of the ditch. As designers, scientists, professionals, when you look at this project area, this 122 acres or however we calculate it, what do you think is the right kind of spatial framework? Like, is it just those 122 acres, or how far would you go in either direction when you're trying to calculate the impacts and what's best for this future area? I'd usually choose the guy who scratches his chin first, but I'll defer to Geeta since she's the woman on the panel. Geeta, how about it?
So the question is, how are we defining the site?
We're given this 122 acre framework, but as we all know, and as the traffic studies will show, you know, it's really a lot bigger than that. So
yeah, I mean,
how would you construct a project area for this?
Well, we have to really look at it in terms of almost like 3 scales, right? Or maybe even 4 scales. And so there's the scale of the site, which is even going to be smaller than the BMT, because eventually if this project moves ahead and gets developed, ideally there are multiple developers coming in and multiple stakeholders, potentially even the community coming in as a developer, which I'm a big advocate for. And so that would be the scale of the site, right? A portion within BMT. And then there is the BMT, and then there's the maritime zone. Hopefully the maritime zone is 100% of the BMT or maximized as much as possible. But then there's the sort of regional, I don't want to just say community, because there are multiple communities that are involved here. And so we have to really look at the scale of not just Red Hook, not just Columbia Heights. It does go up to or beyond the BQE. It goes into Brooklyn Bridge Park. This will have impacts much greater than just one single site. And so then you have to be looking at this whole upland zone. And this is as a designer, you're always looking at big scale, small scale, big scale, small scale. And you have to perpetually be looking at all of those relationships to each other and those speaking to each other and zooming out, zooming in, and that is with water, energy, social infrastructure, economics, right? So all of that gets integrated into those networks.
Good point. Hey, question to bring up the maps. I don't know if it's possible to bring up the project map while the panel's going on, but we had that question from a couple people. Someone pointed out the lack of mass transit, you know, and that's the story of Red Hook, right? I mean, to a certain degree, and still kind of a continuing issue. Any suggestions out there amongst the panelists about what a transportation system to connect this, you know, to downtown and adjacent neighborhoods might look like?
Should I go again? I will speak quickly. And somebody actually, so I had mentioned Hoffman City has buried parking, and I saw in the chat, somebody was like, we don't need any cars, we don't need any parking. And in an ideal world, true, it would be great if we didn't have to build parking into the site. I think we do have to build some parking, and that is currently partly because there is not great mass transit. But if we then encourage greater ferry system, really relying on our Blue Highway, being able to rely on a better bus service. Red Hook has been advocating for better bus service for decades. And realistically, you know, from deep inside Red Hook, it's a 20-minute walk to the G train. When you're up at Columbia Street, it's a 10-minute walk to the G train. So it's not the end of the world, right? But with better bus service, with potentially, you know, some type of automated, you know, sort of like rail system, or but really starting to rely on our ferry system. I think our ferry system has served Red Hook really, really well, and that can just be enhanced by, you know, sort of creating more waterfront access.
And connected to that transportation question, does anyone know if the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is considered part of this project area or within the scope of the design team? That okay, old trolley
I
tunnel.
mean, it has
under
not been
Atlantic Avenue.
mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Hey, a couple questions in the chat kind of point to the tension between, you know, managed retreat, given coastal trends and climate trends, versus, you know, the need to densify in urban areas where the people already live, and obviously the housing situation that we're in, housing crisis that we're in. How do you, as professionals, how do you try to balance that mix or resolve that mix, or address those conflicting perspectives? Walter, I see a nod there. You want to unmute?
Sure. Yeah, I bet me, Klaus, and Gita were both working with City Club on de-incentivizing zoning or upzoning in the floodplain, and that letter was published. I think it's really important, you know, that you take an incremental approach. It's important to not take away entitlements without thinking about the financial impact, especially for working families that are homeowners. But at the same time, we should not be upzoning properties that are in the floodplain to begin with. In the short future, we have to find a way, without having an economic impact on existing working families in the floodplain, we do have to find a way to not build in the floodplain anymore. But incrementally, we have to start with, if you do build in the floodplain, and it's a must, you have to build a certain way, and it has to be integrated, multi-layered with a community approach, and not just looking at your site at your own lot.
Thank you for that.
Can
Gita, Klaus, you want to add anything? Yeah, please.
I just want to add quickly. I think retreat is going to be absolutely a part of the conversation in terms and a part of the toolbox that we have to look at realistically in order to survive the next 100 years. And that's a responsibility that we will have to the next several generations. I do think it requires us starting the conversation now. We can't start the conversation when it's too late, because this is going to be a very difficult and challenging experience in time. But at the same time, we can look at it positively, and we can look at it as a way to make our lives better. And we can look at it as a way to make our communities just sort of better equipped in terms of transportation and, you know, amenities and school districts and et cetera, in terms of how we actually manage and I think it's not just managing the retreat, it's also at the same time, what is the proper zoning for these waterfront locations? As we retreat, in some locations, we may be building floating structures, and we may actually be moving out into the water. So while there's one going in one direction, it may be that there's some going in the other direction. And then what is the appropriate land uses that can happen in that liminal space? I don't think we actually need to approach it as a black and white issue. It's not oh, you can be there, or oh, you can't be there, right? So even the Rockaways, right, Walter, had shacks that were occupied as summer shacks, right? And they weren't, Rockaways wasn't occupied as a permanent residential space for most of its history. It's a very short window of time.
Even in its indigenous history, the Lekawe, who were a clan of the Lenape, you know, being an indigenous, you know, heritage, I'd like to work within the citizens of the First Nation in our region. And the Lekawe clan were known for moving seasonally. So they would build structures for 5 or 10 years at a time that they would occupy seasonally, and then move that structure based on the movement of protein and fish. And so that's important. It was a cyclical situation until the era of Robert Moses, where we started to lock in from seasonal housing to permanent housing. And that static condition was not in line with the dynamic forces of nature. I will add on the topic of there was a question by Susanna Drake about the feasibility of floating cities and such. You know, Red Hook is uniquely positioned to be able to support that typology. As opposed to Rockaway, there's only a few pockets in Rockaway where there's enough still water, low fetch to support that. But there already is voluntarily floating cities in Rockaway. Those marinas, people are living there, whether they're allowed to or not in the summer. Marina 59 is one of them. And it's organically organized houseboats, but there's a whole culture on the finger docks, so like a street in New York. So it's happening all around the city in little pockets, but it's important to look at the feasibility of it. It's a high cost. The Dutch had figured it out. They're putting dorms in it, but it has these other opportunities that other places don't. And the other piece to think about, the floodplain will become the future amenities, right? Not just open space amenities, but hotels and temporary use. I see Rockaway's future in by 2100 being this kind of sandbar out and at sea that's going to have a few temporary uses, camping and more of a national park recreation type facility. But every homeowner I've spoke to in Rockaway, a dozen different neighborhoods, they all are estate planning for a long-term future where their grandchildren may not, inherit the home that they have. And there's definitely an endpoint to the existence there.
Right. And then to bring it back to BMT, with that in mind, then how do we rightfully, I think a maritime use on that site, absolutely appropriate. If it's built properly and it's built smartly and it's built with the future in mind, it can withstand a watery future, right? Housing, a little bit harder to deal with. And so then the question is, are we willing to put people in that vulnerable position? And are we willing to spend the money and sink those dollars and that carbon footprint into this location when it should be thought about in a different, like I said, paradigm shift. This is the start of the paradigm shift. And how do we use this opportunity to ensure that that's happening?
Thank you for that. Before we lose transit, which apparently struck a nerve in Red Hook because our Q&A box just overflowed with suggestions for express buses. And do you know about this transportation alternatives petition for a direct bus from Red Hook to Manhattan? So look up some of these things online while we're chatting as a group. But obviously mobility is a big issue, shall we say, between the ditch and the water. There's already a couple huge mobility issues there, not to mention along the situation along the heights. I want to bring it back to numbers though for a minute, because historically, a lot of these waterfront development proposals and a lot of these waterfront development debates, focus on sometimes qualitative values, too high or not high enough, or too luxury or not affordable enough. And as designers, you bring a great sensibility, and you've already given us some great ideas about, what are some of the numbers that you incorporate as professionals? Walter, you mentioned, plus 16 for sort of, I guess, your base flood elevation out in Rockaway. Klaus, you mentioned we shouldn't be doing anything in New York City at less than plus 14. But, given that the way water moves around a harbor and an estuary is not linear or necessarily consistent. For instance, the storm surge down in Tottenville at the bottom of Staten Island, the southern extent, was 2.5 feet higher than the storm surge at the Battery. What kind of quantitative metrics do you as professionals use to help communities, to help property owners, to help policymakers, to help your real estate clients, whoever? What kind of quantitative metrics do you use to try to help figure out, the best solution for your waterfront or climate vulnerable projects? Is it as simply as elevation? Is it a dollar value, a quantifiable risk? What's that 1% risk in dollar value? of the built project that you're trying to either pay for or get financed. When we have these conversations, and they're going to go on because they've been going on in the Brooklyn Piers for 40 plus years, how can we help participants here obviously clearly engage? You can see it in the Q&A. What are some quantifiable questions that they can be asking to help us as taxpayers, ratepayers, citizens, parents, workers, help make the best kind of public decision for the public?
Well,
Klaus, you should speak. Go ahead. Yeah.
New York State has what's called CRRA. That's the Community Resilience and Recovery Act. And it gives certain guidelines how to address what is a proper metric. So the lifetime of a project comes in. Now, what is the lifetime of a project? That is in the eye of the beholder. There is no clear way to define that. But I mean, it should, if there were any housing, for instance, it should be at least 60, 80, maybe 100 years. So, which means we have to look at least to 2100 and beyond, just in terms of sea level rise alone. Not to speak of all the things that Walter addressed, like saltwater intrusion that raises the water level, groundwater level, and all these other things that go with it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Klaus. I think the other part that we as a society need to think about is, what does that grade level experience feel like and look like? And we don't currently live in cities that are raised up above the floodplain. I'm going to give a shout out to the book 2140, Kim Stanley Robinson, because there's a lot of climate futurism visions in there that really think about what it is to exist on another level, on another plane. We're really at grade right now. And my students did a project in Red Hook 10 years ago now that we'll be revisiting in the fall, where they proposed raising street grade, right? And having bridges and connecting buildings at upper levels. I think we have to figure out, because once you lift a building up off the street and you have a hardened edge, you lose that street activity, you lose that life, you lose that urban fabric that we all yearn for, and that New York City is why we live here, because it's that activated core. So we have to be very careful about how we do that, and then what that means for us at grade. Robert Moses's BQE ripping communities in half is an example of urban design gone awry. And so we may find one solution, but that solution may then beget problems for us. So I just worry, and once again, like, it just takes time and thinking about how we're going to do this and do it right.
I would add to Gita with, to bring the spirit of Jane Jacobs and climate resiliency together, is to ask, what would Jane do? WWJD is thinking about the correlation between the sidewalk and the ground floor program. If they're disconnected, that's the beginning of a dying city. And, that's what's happening in the coastal zone 1 of New York, the Jersey Shore. There's just this vacuous forms up against the sidewalk. What makes our city unique, and what was the driver of Arvernese, was to find some way. Starting 10 years ago, we put a stake in the ground, so the sidewalks are not going to be disconnected from the ground floor program. We're going to do what it takes to get these streets at plus 16. We couldn't get the neighboring streets to get there, but we got the private streets up there. And I'll leave with you, that's an important question, Carter, that you raise around quantifying. And there are a few metrics that we look at as a firm when advising developers and P3 managers from cities. That is to look at, the mortgage cycles that Klaus pointed to. Arvernese, we're looking out 3 mortgage cycles, that can we buy time for 3 mortgage cycles? For the issue, though, comes down to the problem with looking 90 years out or 2100 or whatever, is it builds atrophy like inertia. Like there's time to figure it out. When in fact, when you look at the economic side of it, in my home that I own in Rockaway on the bay, 2 or 3 times a year on the king tide, if it coincides with a small storm, I have to get in my stand-up paddleboard and take my neighbors to the train, to the A train, by water vehicle. So I have to, my neighbor that works she's a postal worker. She's in her post office gear. I put her on my stand-up paddleboard and take her to the A train so she can get to work. And that happens frequently now. And that has a socioeconomic impact on working families. But I had the opportunity to work with Eric Smith from Swiss Re. He's a CEO, just retired former CEO of Swiss Re America. And it really comes down, until we dismantle capitalism as a driver of city form, we're going to have to play within its rules. And the DNA of capitalism is the insurance market, and more importantly, the reinsurers. And that's another pulse to look at. It's these economic pulses aren't just the king tides that are interrupting work life. It's the insurance markets, and you're seeing it in Florida. Working class people are leaving Florida in droves in the past 24 months because of the collapse of the insurance market. My flood insurance on my own house has gone up in Rockaway, and it's coming here. And that's important to point out, because if we don't design our streets to be elevated, we're going to be walking our dogs in floods after work, which is what's happening in Miami Beach, another place that I work. So, this is real, and it's happening now, and it's becoming more frequent. So look at the frequency of these pulses, economic pulses, cultural pulses, because that's the real impact. And once you look at how many frequent floods that are happening, Klaus and I always message each other, because he lives up in the Hudson River in a low-lying area, and I'm at the mouth of the river in a low-lying area, and we're always comparing notes on the king tides and how's it looking over there. And that's just daily life, but we're conditioned for that. But not everyone needs to be thinking about that in their daily life. And so housing needs to be in a protected zone, high ground, underground power, so the power stays on. This idea of community resiliency hubs should just be the entire neighborhood and not just a hub, right? And so we need to design differently if our only solution is community resiliency hubs.
And just to illustrate that, even so I'm the expert, right? My family has lost 3 cars so far to flooding.
I saw the car 20 years ago, Klaus. I saw it coming. But not everybody can ride a bike around town, right? We all have different systems, different infrastructures, different needs.
So
Walter,
Carter, if I
go
can
ahead.
interject a question, and the conversation is just so fascinating, and very, very grateful for that. But Carter, in your introduction, you said something that was very spot on, is that the political context is also incredibly important. So how do you think the political context can actually help support the great recommendations that you're making? Do you think that they are thinking in terms of insurance and reinsurance markets as they are looking at the planning phase? And I mean, I have my hunch on what the answer is, but I would love to hear how do you believe our elected officials, the administration, the city council are looking at these issues?
I'm
going to send that to a panelist, maybe even Geeta, since she's
short
closest.
answer is
Go,
they
Klaus.
don't. They don't. And for instance, if we talk about densifying in high elevation neighborhoods, well, the representatives of those neighborhoods that sit in the city council, they say, my constituents say, NIMBY, not in my neighborhood, any densification. So that's why we are still building on the waterfront, because these are the abandoned industrial and commercial waterfront properties that were available to the developers. So unless we have a comprehensive plan for the entire city that addresses this as an overall project, we will do always the wrong things, just going plot by plot, neighborhood by neighborhood.
There is a greater good to be realized. Totally agree with Klaus.
I will
Walter.
add that
Go ahead.
the county, Miami-Dade County, Mayor Cava, last month had a convening of insurance thinkers, multiple reinsurers to help her advise on a policy that was insurance influence. Because as we know, insurance is the DNA of capitalism. You can't get a mortgage without insurance, right? So the whole thing, whole house of cards falls apart. So I hope, someone in this city will have a similar convening that's insurance driven, either at the commissioner level or mayor level, but it needs to start happening where the decision making and authority is occurring.
So let me ask you that actually, Walter. This is actually really, really fascinating. So currently, both the mayor and the city council have introduced a charter revision commission, or they have appointed a charter revision commission. And, with the goal of putting to referendum possibly some charter revision recommendations. Is there an opportunity here to actually, inflect a little bit the way the city is thinking about these issues? Is it time that the charter actually mandates a 10-year citywide plan, which, currently kind of we're supposed to, but we don't? How can we actually use these commissions? One, being the city council being probably more sympathetic to these recommendations than the mayoral one. But, how can we actually leverage that?
Yes, here's a quote I'll share with you. So Parks Commissioner Mitchell Silver, on his last, year in office, him and I were on a boat in Jamaica Bay. And he said, I try my best, Walter. He goes, there's two types of cities in America. There's deal-making cities and there's plan-making cities. And he said, I learned that New York City is a deal-making city. So you have to embrace capitalism and recode it. He goes, I tried. He goes, I wanted to do a Parks Department master plan, and then maybe that would influence a New York City master plan. He goes, why is the RPA the only group thinking about the relationship across all these cities in the mega region? Where I grew up in Miami, they have the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. It's a kind of a blue bubble within the red state, but they share information through academia, policy, science, community. These little villages and towns and cities all agglomerate from Palm Beach, Broward, down to Monroe County, from Key West up to Palm Beach, sharing resources because they're kind of on their own. But if we had that kind of leverage happening in the Northeast, where Boston to Philly, we're all connected, that as a mega region, we need that as a governing body and not just NGO like RPA. So that's a big deal, not just the city, but thinking about the region. And yes, we need a regional plan and we need a city plan, a master plan that is economically influenced and, of course, looking at climate.
So I'm going to play off of Walter a little bit, and 100% yes. And in order to do that, we have to slow the process down. I mean, you cannot achieve what Walter and Klaus are advocating for in a 6-month, community process. You absolutely cannot. And you cannot do it by assuming a hierarchical system where you quote unquote have an advocacy task force that is kind of saying yes or no, right? And not really being fully integrated into the process. And so you have to slow it down. And I think you got to blow it up. And honestly, I'm going to just put out a pretty radical thing out there. May not be popular, but I'm not sure that EDC is the one that ought to be the one developing this. They maybe potentially ought to be creating an entity that is made up of a whole wide group of experts at the table that are actually developing this. And that is a very different process than it living in one house or one agency that is the one that's making all the decisions. And so in the long run, the community has no say, right? Our agencies, our other agencies have very little say. And it's hard to actually have it be this more radical process. It is what Walter is saying. It becomes transactional, it becomes fast, and it becomes potentially short-sighted. So, I just wonder if there's just a really different way. And at the same time, it doesn't mean to stop the process. I think that that's also a really important thing, is that like this parcel needs to be developed. The maritime needs to be upgraded. The piers need to be repaired. Red Hook and its adjacent communities want more jobs associated with maritime industry. So all of those things are fully desired, wanted, needed. We just want a better process to make that happen.
Great point, Geeta. Let me just tie a couple things together as we get towards the end. The Q&A box is still open, and the questions that aren't answered hopefully will be answered by the panelists by text if we run out of Zoom time. But I just want to give a shout out to the EDC task forces and the work that they are doing. A lot of people on those task forces, and the presentations and videos from some of the public meetings are all on the EDC project website. So worth taking a look. I want to emphasize the point that Walter and panelists all made. There's a lot of other examples from other places. And we're not just talking about physical examples. You see them in Hoffman City, you see them in Rotterdam, you see them in Miami, elsewhere. There's examples for other mechanisms or other approaches, because as we know, visioning can take a long time. It's interesting to see Boston come down to New York City, and New York City sometimes go up to Boston. Like Boston is a little bit behind New York City, but learning lessons from us. Another theme that has to be addressed as any kind of project like this moves forward is there's a lot of existing systems there. The wastewater and stormwater treatment collection system. What is new investment? What might that mean both for stresses on the system as well as opportunities for new investment in the system? There's a lot of technologies out there for gray water recycling and even black water recycling on the building scale, household scale, et cetera. If we could put that green economy and that blue highway system together. One more point I'd like to make is it's the how we build. We've been talking about Hicks Street and the ditch for decades. Been talking about rebuilding the BQE, intensively for the past 10 years. Right now, people may not see it, but New York City is barging milled and C&D debris out of Newtown Creek every day, sending it up into the Hudson Valley, to old landfills, to industrial properties, as these property owners use New York City C&D to elevate their own property out of the flood zone and out of harm's way. Not necessarily advocating for those facilities to be built next door to you or at this site, but we've got to tap into the resource flows that the city has already, and there's a lot of material that we could be using and sourcing locally when we envision how we build in the future. A couple questions about when the BQE gets rebuilt, the triple decker, like could that material come into this site by water as opposed to having it all moved by truck? But the last thing I want to say before we go around the horn with the panelists is just remember, visioning as well as planning and design does take time. So I think we all need to leave this meeting with what do we do next to help bring about the optimal outcome of a really special 122 acres and 200 wet acres along with it, with city capital money that could come. What do we do next in terms of our outreach and engagement, neighbors, task force members, EDC, et cetera? So I will start with Geeta and then maybe Walter Klaus and turn it over to Layla for some closing remarks.
Oh, so much to do next. Besides calling your congresspeople every morning to advocate for things happening on the federal level, we should also be advocating with our city council. They actually have quite a serious, role in this decision-making process, engaging with our local community efforts. There's a public meeting being hosted by Resilient Red Hook and their partnering organizations on the 18th, where we'll be discussing this issue at greater length. There are a variety of different so petitions to be signed. We're advocating for slowing down the process. There's a group of community members who are trying to design a park called Fort Defiance Park, so you can check them out. I don't know, there's just a lot. So, you know, I think it's finding your niche and finding what your interests are, and picking up a pen and paper and writing some letters and advocating. I have been heartened because this has actually galvanized quite an amazing group of people, including the people at this table. So it's pretty wonderful to see everybody coming together to try and work together. And I think that's part of what the EDC process is disappointing, is it feels like it's trying to splinter. And I think we really want to do the opposite and try and bring everybody together around this.
Thanks, Geeta. Walter?
Yeah, so I'll share a quick little story in closing, from the Sister City panel that was put on by CUNY recently, last year, and we're convening again. And it was, you know, the Sister City relationship between Copenhagen and New York around cloudbursts. And after that panel, we had drinks with the Copenhagen folks and in Wall Street, one of the bars, and Copenhagen folks are on one side of the bench and we're on the other side of the picnic table bench. And they looked and they said, Copenhagen used to have the same problem that American cities have. And we're like, well, we have a lot of problems, but which one are you referring to? And they said, well, in the 60s, 70s, we had highways in our downtowns and we had all these things going on. We asked ourselves intellectually, like, why is it like that? We don't want this, but, you know, how do we get decision makers again in line with a human city? And she said, the city manager said, you know, we were 95% one discipline making all decisions. Engineers, said it was mostly engineers making decisions. Said, engineers, we need them, but too many of any type of person is a bad thing, right? So she said we needed intellectual diversity. So they did an audit through City of Copenhagen. And now, fast forward generations later, she said it's a mix of engineers, designers, planners, scientists, you know, even people linguistics background, fine arts, liberal arts. Every discipline is in the room in having power and authority and decision making. And she said then it started to change, because not only did we come up with good ideas, but we can implement those good ideas. He said, and not just be a dream that's put on the shelf and never built, which is as good as never existing. And I thought, flash in the pan, how do we do that in New York? How do we audit intellectually through DCAS? You know, what is our intellectual makeup of the people making decisions of our city form, infrastructure, you name it? And how do we make sure we have a interdisciplinary mix in that space of power where the sausage is being made? And in that, I would say we need a chief coastal commissioner, a kind of coastal commissioner in New York City, who is centered between folks like the lifeguards in Rockaway and how you manage a coastline properly, as well as all the harbor economy. So the pilot, you know, the pilot ships and all the industrial maritime economy. And then, of course, making space for the new Blue Highway and carbon neutral shipping that's bringing back smaller ships that are sail driven to deliver cargo is a globally growing thing and is happening locally here. And we need different size piers for that. And that comes from water-centered decision making, which a coastal commissioner would bring. They would have to have that resume with that background of coast and harbor planning. The second position I would recommend, and I'll leave with this, is for the city to get in touch with its historical roots. That is, you know, the work of Eric Sanderson, Manhattan, and to have a chief indigenous officer, a CIO, that pulls from any of the many intact tribes in our region, in the tri-state area, to be centered on connecting the dots to the verbal history that's intact, going back to the last ice age. It gives us a lot of information. When you want to look forward, you look back 10,000 years, and these folks have that information. Let's center that in our decisions in city making.
Thank you, Walter. Klaus.
Well, given that this property until recently was Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, they had their own vision and interests. And apparently they are more interested where the big boats go rather than where smaller boats go. Now that this property is city, it needs a full integration with all the other infrastructure, transportation, water, sewer, you name it. And if I look at the EDC plan, the word of sea level rise and climate change and flooding barely shows up. It's like an afterthought. All they are worried about is how they finance this project, and that's how the housing came in. I think they're putting the cart before the horse. You have to start in this kind of system where the water goes, and then think about how you manage the water, whether in the coastal area, in the subsurface, you name it, and then start to plan what you built on it. And they have it backwards.
Thank you, Klaus. And thanks to our panelists. And thank you, Layla, who's going to tell us what actually happens next. Layla, welcome.
Thank you so much. Really, it was a very, very robust and enlightening conversation. I'm very, very grateful for all of your insight on this really, really important topic. So, as we said, the Brooklyn Marine Terminal redevelopment is a project that has really far-reaching implications, and the City Club is going to continue to provide information on this critical issue. I would like to extend a special thanks to our co-chairs of the City Club Waterfront Committee, John Shapiro and Tom Fox. Their leadership in keeping this issue in the public eye has been critical, and we're really grateful for that. I also want to give a huge shout out to Juan Rivero. He is the chair of the City Club's program committee, and we thank him for organizing tonight's event, as well as 2 weeks ago, and many, many more events for the City Club, and ensuring that these conversations continue. We will be doing at least one and possibly 2 other panels on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. It is a complicated issue, deep issue, complex and important one, especially given the accelerated timeline that EDC is telling us we have to follow, although we obviously don't totally agree with this timeline. Thank you again to our panelists, to our wonderful moderator. Thank you so much to our audience, everyone who attended tonight. We had at some point over 120 people logging in on the call. We're really grateful for your participation. Community input is just it's not an afterthought, and it's a fundamental part of the planning process. And we really want the City Club to be an opportunity for the community, for the public, for those voices to be heard. A couple of things that I would like to emphasize. The first one is, as I said, both the city and, meaning the mayor and the city council, have convened commissions to revise the charter. I think that this is a really important opportunity. I have heard some great comments from Walter and Gita and Klaus about, how the city could be better equipped with a different type of administrative approach to the waterfront. To that effect, I want to mention that on Monday, Carolina Salguero testified at the City Council Charter Revision Commission, calling for the creation of a department of the waterfront. She was actually followed by others. I think this is a wonderful effort that is really worthwhile and that would have tremendous impact. So maybe the City Club can continue to foster this conversation around how we can alter the charter to actually better serve the planning, the vision, and the economic needs, the housing needs, rather than leaving it with EDC, which, as great as EDC may be, they're poorly equipped actually to address maritime and waterfront issues. The other thing I will say, as you all know, it is an electoral year. The mayor, all the city council members, as well as the comptroller and the borough presidents are up for election or re-election. This is a great opportunity to make this issue an electoral issue. So, please attend mayoral forums, candidates forums, and make sure that you bring up this issue in these contexts. As Gita said, advocacy is key. Call your congressman, send him or her a letter, make your voice heard. I will say that, because it is under the Port Authority jurisdiction, it is a state issue, and your state legislators, as well as the governor, play an immense role. So they're not off the hook. You can actually, reach out to them. It is really important that, they get to play a role, even if they think that, it's not really their issue. Actually, it is. So, once again, I want to thank you for attending. I want to remind everyone that the City Club is a non-for-profit organization. We are fiercely independent, and we rely entirely on contributions from our grassroots supporters. So if you like what we do, if you want to help us continue doing the work that we're doing, please consider making a tax-deductible donation tonight. You can find us online, cityclub.org. And with all of that said, once again, thank you so much and have a great evening. Good night, everyone.